My mother-in-law planned a family trip to Disney for every grandchild except mine. She said my kids were too young. They were the same age as the others. My mother-in-law sent a group text on a Tuesday morning in March with a Disney World itinerary attached. Hotel bookings, park tickets, dining reservations, the whole thing, clearly planned over weeks. 7 grandchildren listed by name in the Who's Coming section. My kids? Mia, who's 6, and Noah, who's 5, were not on the list. Her other grandchildren ranged from 4 to 8. When I texted her privately to ask about it, she said Mia and Noah were probably still a little young for the trip. Her youngest grandchild going is 4 years old. I've been staring at that text for 3 days trying to figure out what to do with it. So a little background because context matters here. My name is Rachel. I've been married to Greg for 8 years. His mom, Sandra, has always been, I'm trying to find the right word, selective. Not cruel, not openly hostile, just selective in ways that have this specific pattern I noticed maybe 2 years into our marriage and have been quietly cataloging ever since without really knowing what to do about the catalog. Greg has 2 siblings. His brother Derek lives 20 minutes from Sandra, and his sister Patty lives across town from her. We live about 45 minutes away, which isn't far, but Sandra talks about it like we're in another state. The drive comes up a lot. It's such a long drive when explaining why she hasn't seen the kids in a while, which for context is a 45-minute highway drive that I make to drop the kids at her house roughly once a month because Greg thinks it's important for them to have a relationship with his mom. Derek has 3 kids, ages 4, 6, and 8. Patty has 2 kids, ages 5 and 7. Mia is 6, Noah is 5. So when Sandra sent that group text with the Disney itinerary, and I saw 7 names and neither of mine was among them, I had to read it twice to make sure I hadn't missed something. I screenshot the text and sent it to my friend Becca with a single question mark. She called me back in 4 minutes. None of your kids? She said. None of my kids. And the 4-year-old is going? Derek's youngest. Yes, Rachel, I know. I texted Sandra privately before saying anything to Greg, partly because I wanted to understand what I was actually dealing with before bringing it to my husband, and partly because some part of me genuinely wanted there to be a reasonable explanation I hadn't thought of, something that would make the list make sense in a way that didn't mean what it appeared to mean. Hey Sandra, saw the Disney trip. Looks like so much fun. I noticed Mia and Noah weren't included. Just wanted to check if that was an oversight. She responded about 2 hours later. Oh no, not an oversight. I just think they might be a little young still for a trip like this. Disney can be really overwhelming for little ones. Maybe next time when they're a bit older. I read that text approximately 6 times. Then I opened the group text again and looked at the name of Derek's youngest, who is 4 years old and apparently not too young for Disney, and I put my phone face down on the counter and made dinner. Greg got home at 6:30, and I waited until after the kids were in bed to show him everything. The group text, my message to Sandra, her response, he read through it. I watched his face. The 4-year-old thing is a problem, he said finally. Yes, I said. It is. She might just mean Greg. I kept my voice even. Your nephew is 4. Mia is 6. There is no version of too young that applies to our kids, but not to a 4-year-old. That's not what this is about. He was quiet for a moment, which I've learned over 8 years means he knows I'm right and is deciding how to engage with that. I'll call her, he said. I need you to actually talk to her, I said. Not smooth it over. Actually ask her what's happening here. He called her the next evening, in the bedroom with the door closed, which told me he wanted the privacy of a real conversation rather than the performance of one. I sat in the kitchen and did nothing useful for about 30 minutes until he came out. She says she wasn't sure the kids were ready for that kind of travel, he said. That it's a long trip and she didn't want them to have a bad experience. Did you point out that Connor is 4? I did. What did she say? She said Derek and Amy have been taking Connor on trips since he was 2, and he's very experienced with travel. I sat with that for a second. Our kids have been on 4 flights, I said, including when Mia was 18 months. I know. Did you tell her that? I did. And? Greg sat down across from me. She said she'd think about adding them to the trip. Think about adding them. Like they were an afterthought. Like the question was whether to extend a favor rather than why they'd been excluded from something their cousins were included in as a matter of course. I want to be honest that I didn't say everything I wanted to say in that kitchen conversation. Partly because Greg looked genuinely tired and stressed in a way that made me think the call had been harder than he was letting on, and partly because some part of me was still processing what she'll think about it actually meant coming from a woman who had already planned, booked, and distributed an itinerary without including my children. I called my sister that night after Greg fell asleep, the specific quiet of a house where everyone else is, unconscious, and you're sitting in the kitchen going back through a situation you can't stop turning over. She'll think about adding them, my sister repeated. That's what Greg said she said. After they were already left off a fully booked trip. After a fully booked trip with hotel, reservations, and dining packages, my sister made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Rachel, this isn't about age. I know it's not about age, I said. I've known it wasn't about age for years. This is just the clearest it's ever been. The hotel she booked was a Marriott with family suites that sleep 8. I found this out in about 4 minutes on their website, which means Sandra either didn't look or looked and hoped nobody else would. Greg was at work when I found it. I sat with my laptop open on the kitchen counter for a while. The hotel page still up, the suite capacity right there in the listing description. 8 guests. Sandra's trip has 9 people, including the adults, so the room genuinely wouldn't fit everyone. That part was technically accurate, but there were larger options available. 2-bedroom suites, adjoining rooms, configurations that would have accommodated 2 more children without much difficulty or creative logistics. She hadn't looked for those. Or she had and decided not to mention them. I took a screenshot of the hotel page, the same way I'd screenshot the original group text, and added it to what was becoming without my deliberately planning it that way. A folder on my phone of documentation I didn't know what to do with. I didn't show Greg the hotel screenshot that night. Something made me wait. Some instinct that I needed to figure out what I actually wanted to do before I handed more information to a conversation that hadn't gone anywhere useful the first time. What I did instead was think seriously for the first time about the pattern. Not just this trip, all of it. Christmas 2 years ago, Sandra had given each grandchild a personalized ornament with their name and birth year. Mia and Noah got generic ones from a different store, clearly purchased separately and quickly. Sandra said she'd had trouble finding the right ones for them, that the shop she usually used had been out of stock. The shop was online. I checked later. Their stock was fine. Noah's 3rd birthday, Sandra had forgotten. Not missed. Forgotten. Greg called to remind her the day of, and she sent a card that arrived 2 weeks late. Derek's youngest had a birthday party the following month at Sandra's house. School pictures last fall. Sandra has a wall in her hallway with framed school photos of all the grandchildren. When we visited in October, I counted 5 kids represented, updated every year going back to kindergarten. Mia's kindergarten photo wasn't there. Noah isn't in school yet, so I understood that, but Mia has been in school 2 years, and her photo has never made the wall. None of these things, individually, was a smoking gun. Each one had an explanation that sounded plausible if you were inclined to give benefit of the doubt. Taken together, in a folder on my phone on a Tuesday night while Greg slept and I sat at the kitchen counter, they made a picture that was harder to explain away. I brought up the hotel research the following morning, before Greg left for work, because I decided that sitting on it wasn't actually what I wanted to do with it. He looked at the screenshot for a moment, then he looked at me. She could have made it work, he said. Not a question. Easily, I said. Adjoining rooms would have been maybe $100 more per night. For a week's trip that's already in the thousands. He set his coffee down. I'm going to call Derek, he said. This surprised me. Why Derek? Because Derek is my brother and he's going on this trip, and maybe he doesn't know the full picture of how this happened. He paused. Or maybe he does, and that tells me something too. I hadn't thought of that angle. Okay, I said. The Derek call happened that afternoon. Greg told me about it when he got home, standing in the kitchen in his work clothes. The specific energy of someone who'd learned something they'd half expected, but still found uncomfortable to hear. Derek knew, Greg said. Knew what exactly? That Mom was planning to leave Mia and Noah off the list. He said she'd mentioned it to him before she sent the group text. Said she wanted to do a trip with the older grandkids. Connor is 4, I said, for what felt like the 4th time in a week. I know. I said that to Derek. What did he say? Greg was quiet for a second. He said Mom has always found it harder to connect with our kids. That they're a little more reserved than Derek's kids. And she doesn't know how to engage with them as well. I stood in the kitchen and absorbed that. My kids are quieter than Derek's kids. Mia is thoughtful and takes time to warm up to people. Noah is shy in new situations in a way that's completely age-appropriate and has nothing wrong with it whatsoever. And apparently this was the actual reason. Not age, not travel experience, not hotel room capacity. Sandra found it easier to be around the louder, more outwardly affectionate grandchildren, and so those were the ones she'd planned a week at Disney around. Did Derek think that was a reasonable explanation? I asked. Greg's expression answered before he did. He said he understood where Mom was coming from. Of course he did, I said. I want to be honest that something shifted for me after that conversation with Greg. Not in a dramatic way, not a single moment of decision, more like a quiet recalibration of something I'd been holding in a particular position for a long time. I'd spent years, genuinely years, giving Sandra the benefit of the doubt, chalking things up to her being busy or forgetful or not great with kids in general, telling myself the ornaments and the photo wall and the forgotten birthday were individual incidents without a pattern connecting them, working to maintain a relationship between my kids and their grandmother because I believed, and still believe, that grandparent relationships matter, and that it wasn't my job to let my frustration get in the way of that. But the Disney trip was different because it was undeniable. It was 9 names in a group text. one family missing, and an explanation that didn't hold up to 4 minutes of hotel research. And the real reason, delivered secondhand through Greg via Derek, was that Sandra found my children harder to connect with, as though that was a fixed state she had no responsibility to work on, rather than a relationship that required the same effort any relationship requires. My kids weren't too young for Disney. They were too unfamiliar for Sandra to have put in the work to know them well enough to want to take them. I called my mom that evening, not to vent exactly, more because I needed to hear a voice I trusted before I decided what to say to Sandra directly. My mom listened through the whole thing, the group text, the age excuse, the hotel research, Derek's explanation about the kids being reserved. "What do you want to do?" she asked when I finished. "I want to say something to Sandra," I said. "Not to get the kids added to the trip at this point. I don't want them going on a trip with someone who had to be pressured into including them. I just want her to understand what she actually did, even if she never fully admits it. Can you do that without it becoming a bigger thing?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think not saying anything is worse. I've been not saying anything for years, and the photo wall still only has 5 kids on it." My mom was quiet for a second. "Then say something," she said, clearly and once, "and then you'll know what you're actually dealing with." Sunday arrived gray and cold, the kind of February morning that makes everything feel slightly more serious than it might otherwise. Sandra was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her coat still on, a coffee in front of her, the slightly overdressed energy of someone who'd made an effort for a meeting they weren't entirely sure about. She smiled when she saw me, warm enough on the surface, and I sat down and ordered, and we did the small talk thing for a few minutes. The weather, how the kids were doing in school, whether Greg's work project was still keeping him busy. Then there was a natural pause, and Sandra looked at me with the expression of someone waiting to find out what this was actually about, and I decided not to make her wait any longer. "I wanted to talk about the Disney trip," I said. She nodded, the careful nod of someone who'd been expecting this. "I figured that might come up." "The age explanation didn't hold up," I said. "Connor is 4, Mia is 6. I looked at the hotel, and there were room configurations that would have fit everyone. And Greg talked to Derek, who said you'd mentioned before sending the group text that you wanted to do the trip without our kids specifically. Sandra was quiet, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not asking you to add them to the trip," I said. "I'm past that. What I want to understand is what's actually happening, because I've been noticing things for a few years now, and the Disney trip made the pattern impossible to keep explaining away individually." "What things?" she said, and her voice was careful but not defensive, which surprised me, I told her. "Not everything. Not the full catalog, but the significant ones, the ornaments, the photo wall, the forgotten birthday." I kept my voice even and specific, the same way I'd laid everything out to Greg, without editorializing about what each thing meant, just what had happened and what I'd noticed. Sandra listened without interrupting, which I hadn't entirely expected. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking at her coffee. "I know Mia and Noah are different from Derek's kids," she said finally. "They're quieter, more reserved. When I try to engage with them, they don't respond the same way Connor and the others do, and I never quite know what to do with that. They're shy," I said. "Mia especially. She takes time to warm up to people. That's who she is." "I know," Sandra said, "and I think I've taken that personally in a way I shouldn't have. Like their quietness meant they didn't want to be around me, instead of understanding that they need more time." This was more self-awareness than I'd expected from this conversation, and I want to be honest that it caught me slightly off guard, because I'd braced for defensiveness and gotten something closer to acknowledgement. "The photo wall thing bothers me the most," I said, because it did. "Mia has been in school 2 years. Her photo isn't up there. Every other grandchild is represented." Sandra looked genuinely uncomfortable at that. "I kept meaning to ask Greg to send me one," she said. "And I kept not doing it, and then more time passed and it felt awkward to address it, and then it just stayed the way it was." "That's a long time for something to stay awkward," I said. "I know," she said. "You're right." We talked for almost 2 hours, which was longer than I'd planned for, and longer than any conversation Sandra and I had ever had alone. Some of it was uncomfortable, the particular discomfort of 2 people who've been politely navigating around something for years, finally sitting in the middle of it without the buffer of a family gathering, or Greg as the center of gravity. She didn't apologize cleanly, which I want to be honest about. There was no single moment of clear acknowledgement that she'd treated my children differently, and that it was wrong. What there was instead was something more complicated. A series of partial admissions wrapped in context and explanation that added up over 2 hours to something that felt more honest than a clean apology might have anyway. She said she'd always found it harder to connect with Greg's family than with Derek's, and she thought some of that was geography and some of it was personality, and some of it was things she couldn't entirely explain. She said she'd probably let the path of least resistance guide her more than she should have. She said she hadn't thought about how it looked from the outside, from my side, accumulated over years. None of that was an excuse, but it was real, and real felt more useful than a performance of remorse that didn't connect to anything actual. Before we left, I said one more thing, the thing I'd most wanted to say going in. My kids are going to know, eventually, that they were the only grandchildren not invited on this trip. Kids figure these things out, and what they make of that is going to depend partly on what happens after. Not on this trip, that's done, but on what things look like going forward. Sandra looked at me steadily. What would that look like? She said. Going forward. Showing up for them the same way you show up for the others, I said. Not a grand gesture, just the ordinary things. Their school pictures on the wall, remembering their birthdays, choosing the slightly more expensive hotel room when it means they get to be included. She nodded slowly. That's fair, she said. Good, I said. We hugged at the door. The slightly careful hug of two people who have just said difficult things to each other and are finding their way back to some functional version of the relationship from the other side of it. The Disney trip happened in April. Greg and I took the kids to the Cleveland Metro Parks Zoo the same weekend, which was Mia's idea actually. She'd been asking to go for months and we kept saying soon. And this felt like the right weekend for soon. Mia spent 45 minutes at the giraffe exhibit. Noah fell asleep on Greg's shoulders on the way back to the car, completely boneless the way tired 5-year-olds go boneless, and Greg carried him all the way to the parking lot without complaint. It was a good day. A genuinely good day. Nothing performed about it. The group chat was quiet that weekend, except for a few photos Derek's wife posted from Florida. The kids in Mickey ears, Sandra in the middle of the group shot, everyone squinting into the sun and smiling. Greg showed me the photos without comment. I looked at them for a second, then I put my phone away and went to help Mia write in the little journal she'd started keeping about animals. 2 weeks after the trip, a package arrived addressed to Mia. Inside was a framed photo. Mia's most recent school picture, the one from this past fall, in a simple frame with her name on a small plaque at the bottom. No note inside except Sandra's handwriting on the back of the photo itself for the wall. Should have been here sooner. Grandma Mia looked at it for a second, not fully understanding the context, then asked if she could put it in her own room instead. We said yes.